Roosevelt and Churchill were not in total agreement. Roosevelt, and particularly Eisenhower, felt that everything should be focused on the Channel crossing, Normandy, and Northern Europe. Churchill wanted the Italian campaign beefed up and kept active, largely because he was afraid of a second front, Russia in the east. He also had dreams of creating a Balkan campaign so that he could get control of the Balkans, Greece, Yugoslavia as it was then. And he kept hoping to be able to have a campaign that would go across the Adriatic for that purpose. At the next two levels, between Alexander, the British field marshal, who was head of Mediterranean Allied forces, and Mark Clark, who was head at this point of the 15th Army Group, there were conflicts. Mark Clark wanted to do things his own way and largely to boost his own image. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your viewpoint, Alexander's way of leadership was to allow this sort of latitude. So no major public evidence of discord came out, but the discord was definitely there. At the lower levels, there were definite anomalies in leadership, and I'll be covering those more as we move into the 92nd Infantry Division. The 92nd was one of about a dozen units under the 5th Army. You see it there. I've just pulled it out for emphasis purposes. It really should just be listed along with the others in the box below that. And then the division units, the units within the 92nd Division are at the bottom of the page, 13. And I put that arrow on the 365th Infantry Regiment. That's the regiment I found out that Marshall served in. Now, I'm going to switch to reading, as I said, so that hopefully I don't omit something here. First, something about characteristics of the 92nd. It was known as an all-black unit. It was one of a dozen American units under the 5th Army in the Northern Italian campaign. Clark had been the commander of the 5th Army until he was elevated to the 15th Army Group. Truscott, a Texan well known for his roughness and abilities, succeeded Clark. Major General Edward M. Almond was the commanding general of the 92nd. He was a Virginian whose military promotions had been won more through politics than proven battlefield or command abilities. I've got to tell you, as I started putting this together, I got scared to death that somebody's going to raise their hand and say, he's my first cousin. So if he is, don't say it. Under him, almost all officers in the 92nd were white, except for a very few black lieutenants and captains. The enlisted men and non-commissioned officers were all black. Segregation was dominant in the military. This was 70 years ago, and segregation was, if anything, more pronounced in the military than even in the United States itself at the time. Almond tended to blame his black soldiers for his own errors in judgment and command, and his reasoning was tacitly approved by Truscott above him, and no doubt also Clark. This made for a very difficult morale and communication circumstance within the 92nd. Now on page 14, you'll see the 92nd was an average division in size, around 13,000 men. They sustained nearly 3,000 casualties, over 500 of those being men killed in action. They received over 12,000 awards, but the awarding of the highest medals was denied them. In retrospect, their service was distinguished and on a par with other Allied divisions, although at the immediate time their reputation was smeared by Almond's use of them as a scapegoat for his own inadequacies. At the top of page 15, the insignia of the 92nd, who were known as the Buffalo Soldiers, was a black buffalo on an olive drab background, and it signified a long history of service to the nation by all black units. There have been African American soldiers in all of our wars, including the Revolutionary War. The name Buffalo Soldiers arose in the 1860s when black soldiers volunteered for service in the Indian Wars. That designation was given them by the Indians, perhaps because of their dark skin and curly hair reminded them of buffaloes, or perhaps because they wore buffalo hides to supplement their uniforms in the bitter western winters. In the early years of World War I, African American units were purposefully kept out of combat until the Department of War created the 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions as combat units in 1917. The units remained highly segregated, with senior officers all being white and junior officers and enlisted men being black. Now, on the combat actions of the 92nd in the Northern Italian Campaign, at the bottom of page 15. The 92nd fought primarily in the northwestern sector of the Northern Italian Campaign. That was number 4 on that map of Italy earlier. This sector appears at first glance to have been significantly less important than the central and eastern sectors. If one looks at the topographic picture, one realizes that the area involving the Serchio Valley, Massa, and La Spezia forms a mountainous abutment where the Apennines meet the Ligurian Sea. This combination represented the western anchor for the Axis Gothic line, and the Axis powers had reinforced it accordingly. Known as Leghorn to the U.S. troops, to the Allied troops, became the main port for the Allies on the west coast. Piso is just on the northern side of the Arno River. Lucca was one of the first towns occupied in their area after crossing the Arno River. Above Lucca was the Serchio Valley, an Axis stronghold guarding Castelnuovo di Garfagnana, a major communications and supply center tucked away in the North Apennines. Nearer the coast, Massa was a well-fortified town that served as a linchpin for the Gothic line. La Spezia was the major Italian Navy base and the main Axis port. That's where I believe, in your report last time, that Mussolini was taken from Elba.
Held at some
Right.
point, yes.
Genoa was key both as a port and as a gateway into the Po Valley. You see some information there I gleaned from Marshall's military records that his family was kind enough to share with me. Marshall had been educated in the Nashville public school system. He's listed there as having a 7th grade education. He was one of the most savvy individuals I've ever known. His insight into people and his accumulated observations about life were invaluable. He and Annie, his wife of over 60 years, had 3 children. They saw that all 3 had college educations, and all 3 are leading good and productive lives. Their eldest son, Melvin, now lives in Manchester and has several children. Melvin's youngest son, Tim, Marshall's grandson, received a full 4-year scholarship to Harvard and is now working for a financial firm in Chicago. From my point of view, that story tells what this country is supposed to be about. Marshall was buried at the Middle Tennessee Veterans Cemetery near Pegram on McCrory Lane, off westbound I-40. I'd never been there previously. It's a beautiful spot with gently rolling Middle Tennessee hills and beautifully manicured green grass, graced with rows of white markers. The only sound heard that day, other than a gentle breeze, was the nearby constant hum of lawnmowers. My immediate thought was such a sound was wonderfully appropriate for Marshall, who loved mowing our grass better than anything else. It's a satisfying thought to know he's there, and that our nation has continued to repay him for his military service to his country by providing such a wonderful final resting place for him. Thank you.